Welcome to this session on diversity. We're going to have two speakers today talking about different aspects of equality and diversity. Chris Brink is going to present his views on the fundamental educational value of diversity, drawing on his experiences in South Africa as well as in the UK. And Simon's then going to follow up with a rather more parochial picture and closer to home, talking about senior leadership and also our councils and governing bodies and what might be happening there as regards the issues. I'm then going to ask some questions of both the speakers and then hand it over to you for some audience engagement. You've all got the extensive biographies of our two speakers in your pack. I'm just going to reiterate for you that we have been very fortunate in the UK to have Chris Brink amongst our number. He brings a valuable, different set of perspectives to the issues of the day. He never ceases to challenge us in terms of the assumptions, the easy assumptions that we make about our practice. And I had the privilege of serving with him as co-chair of the Equality Challenge Unit, an innovation which I think we felt worked well, that co-chairing, and which we both enjoyed. He's since run off and abandoned me, by the way, so now I have to sit there on my own. But his wisdom and his knowledge certainly, as I've said, benefit not only ECU, but the sector as a whole. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. So morning, everybody. I'm going to try and persuade you of something I learned. And what I learned over time is that quality needs diversity. And as a logician, I should just say, it doesn't mean that I say quality is a sufficient condition for diversity. I'm not saying if you have diversity, you will have quality. I'm saying if you don't have diversity, you won't. And I'll try and get your attention at the outset by some piece of South African history called the Bantu Education Act of 1954, which was introduced in Parliament by a man called Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd, later Prime Minister and the architect of Grand Apartheid. And this is what he said. He said, the school must equip the Bantu to meet the demands which the economic life of South Africa will impose on him. There's no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching a Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice? That's absurd, and so on. It is therefore necessary that native education should be controlled in such a way that it should be in accordance with the policies of the state. And you can think about that and analyze it in various ways, but I just want to lift out two phrases. One is, what is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics? That made, over the ensuing decades, mathematics a hugely political matter. And I was head of mathematics at the University of Cape Town for about 9 years or so in the period before and after 1994. And the black people just did not believe this story about you need a certain level and competence in mathematics to go to university. Why would they believe it? It's always been something that's been a tool of the apartheid government to keep them out of universities. If you think this sort of rhetoric is a million miles from England and the UK today, then can I just highlight the other phrase? Just cut out the racist stuff and just read that sentence. It is therefore necessary that education should be controlled in such a way that it should be in accordance with the policies of the state. That could be said by any minister currently. And I just say that because perhaps not so much has changed. So this was the apartheid picture. There were going to be these independent homelands, the Bantustans, and there they are all color-coded. And because apartheid was going to be separate but equal, every one of those was going to have a university. And so there was another act called the Extension of Universities Act. This is the act that took black people out of universities, the Extension of Universities Act. And initially, there were these universities, because of the history of the country, divided by language, mostly, almost exclusively white, with one exception called the South African Native College, and they looked like this. So some of those you will recognize. Fort Hare was then perhaps the only sort of multiracial place in the country. UNISA, by the way, is the equivalent of the Open University. So that wasn't good enough, and therefore new universities had to be created, and they came in 4 shades, black and white, and colored and Indian. And I apologize to those of you who find the word colored offensive, but it is still, to this day in South Africa, those are the 4 categories in which statistics and data are collected. Colored in South Africa does not mean black. It also does not mean mixed race. It means essentially people who were original inhabitants and or people who came from a Malay background because of the trading routes around the Cape. Recently, people have started using the word brown. So in Afrikaans, many people are call themselves as a marker of identity, brown people, to distinguish themselves from African black people. And these were the universities that were created. There was going to be a university for the Xhosas, a university for the Zulus, a university for the Vendas, a university for the Sothos, a university for the Tswanas, and so on and so forth. Then there would be a new university in Afrikaans for Christian national higher education. I'm an alumnus of that university, so you can judge for yourself how well that worked. There was going to be a bilingual university, which didn't last long, and there was going to be an Afrikaans university for colored people and an Indian university. And because none of those universities had a medical school, that was a bit of a problem because he also wanted there to be a separate but equal medical school for black people, and so that was Medunsa, Medical University of South Africa. So there's a sector. Now here's a question for you. Is this a diverse higher education sector? It's diverse by language, it's diverse by ethnicity, it's diverse by subject, it's diverse by mission. So if you think this is not a diverse higher education, why do you think so? And how is it different from what we believe ourselves to be? So I think that has to do with the question of what do we think diversity looks like? And I'll show you what I think it looks like. It looks like this. And what it doesn't look like is like this. So the latter is the South African apartheid version of diversity. It's all the Smarties of the same color in the same box. And then you have lots of different boxes, and that's what you call diversity. So I think to get to where we are now, I think there's two levels of diversity we should talk about in higher education. The one is the diversity of the sector, and the other one is the diversity within the sector. And the diversity of the sector, if you read in your conference brochure, there's a piece there about celebrating diversity, and it says about where we're at. It says, within this diverse market, different types of institutions sit alongside each other. And I think we should not stop there, because it's not only about the different institutions that sit alongside each other, like the boxes of the red Smarties and the green Smarties and the yellow Smarties and so on. It's also about what happens within. And so what is the diversity profile inside each university? Do you have different colors of Smarties there? And perhaps we should also just go back to basics and say, does it matter? And if you think it matters, why does it matter? So I'd like to talk about this a bit, why diversity matters. And I think it does. And I think it does because we are educational institutions. And I believe, diversity has an inherent educational value. And I'll give you two reasons why I think so. Here's the first one. Diversity is an educational value because it creates opportunities for learning. I certainly would not have learned very much if I hadn't met other people, different people. Where I grew up, it was very remote. I was an adult before I spoke English. I was an adult before I saw a television set. I was an adult before I ever ate a mushroom. And I learned from all those experiences and others like that. And as a university, if you say we are an educational institution, then our job is to learn. Not just as students, not just to teach. Our job is not just to teach. Our job is to learn. And I want to relate that to my previous life before coming to England at a place called Stellenbosch. So if Alan would kindly click on that hyperlink over there. This is a town called Stellenbosch. Some of you may know about it. Some of you may have been there. It's very beautiful, very tourist attraction. It's very well known for wine. Some of the wine you get in the restaurant might well come from there. In fact, this place, the big place in front at the bottom, is called the Bergkelder. There's lots of wine in there. It's very well known for rugby, so we'll keep an eye open for Stellenbosch people in the World Cup next year. But what is less known is that this is where apartheid was invented, in this beautiful little town. There's a long association. The University of Stellenbosch was intimately connected with the development of apartheid, the conceptualization, the development, the implementation of apartheid largely came out of this town, out of Stellenbosch. And Hendrik Verwoerd was a professor of sociology at the University of Stellenbosch. The first apartheid prime minister, D.F. Malan, was a dominee, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church in Stellenbosch. When Verwoerd was assassinated, his successor was a man called John Foster. Foster was an alumnus, of course, of Stellenbosch, and he became the chancellor. And Foster's successor, P.W. Botha, was the chancellor of the university. When I went there, I was recruited from Australia, where I went from UCT. And I was only the 7th Vice-Chancellor of Stellenbosch University in 100 years or so. I was the first ever outside appointment. I was the first ever not to be an alumnus, from inside the university. I was the first ever not to have been a member of the Afrikaner Broederbond, which was the secret organization behind the National Party. I was the first ever not to have been a member of any political party or to have been a member of any of the cultural Afrikaner organizations. And the question confronting me was, what do you do with a legacy like that? As a university, talk about impact. Here's a university that has a major impact in the world. Now, what do you do with a legacy like that? How, in the new South Africa, I went in 2002, 8 years after 1994. For a university like that, 8 years after 1994, they just kept their head below the parapet. What do you do to bring that into a rainbow nation? So if we can go back, please, to the... And I thought I'd better grasp the bull by the horns. And in Stellenbosch, the custom is, very nice custom, that at the beginning of the academic year, which is January, of course, this is the Southern Hemisphere, there's an academic opening, which has the usual academic procession, and the Vice-Chancellor makes a speech, and so on. And I thought, it was a few weeks into my tenure, I thought I'd better put the cards on the table. And so this is what I said. Stellenbosch University needs more diversity, and not as a political gesture, not only to redress the past, but because of the nature of what we are. We're a university. Our business is about knowledge. And so that means we have to learn. And that's where we derive the educational value, because we will learn more from those people and those ideas and those phenomena that we don't know than from those that we know only too well. And so this university needs to be a good university, it needs around us people who reflect the South African society, the true new South African society, because that will give us a diversity of ideas that will be new to us, and so we can learn from that. So that's my first reason why, and that's the personal history of why I say diversity has educational value. Here's a second reason. Ability can crop up anywhere. Here's a little story. Some of you may know about this man. He's called Ramanujan. He grew up in a remote Indian village, and he never sort of had a big job or anything like that, but he used to scribble mathematical equations. And nobody really understood these mathematical equations that he used to scribble. And so at some point he tried to get that better known. And so he sent it off to England to some mathematicians to say, I've been thinking about this mathematical stuff. And twice he had either no answer or no can't be bothered answer, until he happened to send them to a mathematician at Cambridge called G.H. Hardy. And Hardy actually read the papers. These sort of rather grubby papers that came from an unknown young Indian man. And he said, my God, you know, there's something weird here. This guy is either a crank or a fake or a genius. And it turned out that he was a genius. And so Cambridge University brought him over from India, not a trivial matter at the time. And they installed him in Trinity College, and he became an FRS, and he collaborated with Hardy and Littlewood, the mathematicians, on really fundamental stuff. That's not something that came through an elite schooling system. It was just innate talent. But the point of that little story is if Hardy didn't do it, we wouldn't have had a Ramanujan. So ability can crop up anywhere, but ability needs opportunity to translate into attainment. And that's where I think we can come in, because we can and we should, I think, play a role like a Hardy that says, fortune threw this in my path and I'm not going to let it go. So here's another thing I said when I went to Newcastle, and again I came here as it were from another planet, and that was in my sort of inaugural year. That was the guiding principle that I put to the university, which has since been taken up in a few places. If you Google that, a few universities here actually use that on their websites. Ability should be able to access opportunity regardless of circumstance. Now, I don't want to complicate matters, but I just should point out that the diversity also raises a risk, and that risk is inequality. Arguably, if you don't have any diversity, you don't have any need for an equality agenda, because we'd all be the same, and so it wouldn't be a problem. But the risk of inequality, I think here, is particularly manifested through something that I learned from Howard Newby. And this is one of our colleagues, Howard Newby, who said the English have a genius for turning diversity into hierarchy. And of course, that was what went wrong with the original sort of black and white divide idea of in South Africa. It was always going to be separate and never going to be equal, because it was always going to be hierarchically structured. So that, I think, is a very dangerous form of diversity, because the higher-ups will always consider the lower downs to be inferior. It's in the nature of hierarchies. And then you don't want to learn from them. And if you don't learn from them, then you lose the opportunity to raise quality. So this is sort of the take-home message. I think socio-diversity is valuable to the intellectual environment of the university in somewhat the same way as biodiversity is valuable to the natural environment. It's that rich spectrum. It's the way things interact and hang together. And that's why I think that quality needs diversity. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. I hope we'll have time to talk about the issues that you've raised. Simon-Fanshawe similarly needs very little introduction from me. Just to say that Simon has previous as a two-term serving chair of a university council, but also finds all kinds of new and different ways to challenge us about our practices in terms of equality and diversity in his day job, as well as entertaining us at the weekend, eviscerating the national newspapers if any of us should accidentally sit upon our remote controls on a Saturday or a Sunday morning and turn the television on. Simon.
Thank you very much, Janet. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for asking me to join Chris and Janet on the panel. And I would just like to say, before I begin, and I said this to Alan in the break, the students and the staff who've been organising us here are so polite. I don't think I've ever experienced such politeness. So thank you very much indeed to Leeds for giving us such a welcome. This is very informal, and I hope there'll be questions, no feedback forms, which is a great relief. I did a conference recently and there was a pile of feedback forms, and I looked at them to see what somebody had said about me, and they'd written, if I only had an hour left to live in my life, I'd want to spend it listening to a speech by astar-fanshawe. And at the end there was an asterisk, and I turned to the continuation page and they'd written, because it would seem like eternity. So I don't mind people looking at their watches, but if you'd be kind enough not to tap them to see if they're still working while I'm speaking, I'd be grateful. One of the things I have done recently in higher education is that I was asked to write a roadmap for equality for higher education, and this was a piece commissioned by Hefke and the CUC. So I'll draw on that and my time as chair of Sussex, and also the work that we do in the consultancy, where we work with a number of universities. When I very first started being chair of Sussex, I was asked to go and talk at the Sussex dinner, and Sussex is the organisation which is the former senior academics at Sussex. And so these are the people, by the way, who actually have the original tablets of stone as handed down by Asa Briggs from the mountain in their own desk. So these are intimidating and frightening people. But it was also an audience full of enormous brains, and I feel similarly intimidated today. The experiences I want to pass on to you, as I say, have come from a number of projects we've done in a number of universities in recent years. It's generally assumed, and it's been emphasised twice this morning, that British higher education is a sector at the top of its game. David Feingold said the world's leading higher education system this morning. You will, of course, know that 6 out of the top 20 universities in the UK are in the top 20 of universities in the world. David Willett, not a bad advocate of the sector, constantly would say, you know, we are not complacent and we must work harder to remain the best. And even the German ambassador said recently, the best British universities are the best in the world. So if we are that great, what is there to fix? And how can you, people of good intent, of serious motivation to create leading, curious institutions ready to equip students for an increasingly complex world and to inspire academics whose brains and judgments will tackle the world's greatest challenges, how can you fix it? Now, I'm not a great one for arithmetic descriptions of diversity. I think the debate about diversity, while flowing from the core concerns about demographic accountability and identity, is about a wider set of differences and how to manage them creatively, which is tough. And whatever words you use, diversity, inclusion, difference, the fundamental objective is to enable people to unlock their fullest potential and remove barriers in that unlocking. That is really what we talk about when we talk about diversity. The basic figures are stark, though, and I quote them not to point a finger, but to remind us. Women are 54% of academics at entry level, but less than half that percentage at 21% of the professoriate. People with disabilities account for 18% of the population of the UK, but only 3.7% of academic staff have a disability. The BME population of the UK is 17%, whereas only half of that, at 8.6% of academic staff, are BME, which would reflect the population if you lived in Sevenoaks, Southend-on-Sea, or Worthing, all of which are very nice places to live. And I live in Brighton, except I would say Worthing. Worthing's a very dull place. It doesn't twin with anywhere in Europe, but it does have a suicide pact with Eastbourne. Those figures are very slightly improved if you include the professional services and manual staff. But look, two things. Firstly, some departments have made great strides, and there is change, especially using Athena Swan, and the new Equality Charter mark, and the stuff that David and others have developed at the ECU. And secondly, why should academic populations reflect the population at large? Well, here's another figure that sits alongside that failure to promote women. If you look at British Caribbean heritage academics compared with white academics, of all white British academics, 11% of them are professors. If you look at British Caribbean academics, that's already those working as academics, under 1/5 of that, only 2% have been promoted to professors. There is something wrong here. If we're that great, if we can make the scientific advances, the cultural advances, the enormous contribution universities do make daily to the improvement of the quality of lives of people, from graduates to patients to scholars to the poorest in the world, why aren't we shifting those figures in any significant way? If the best of what we do is the best of the world in teaching and research, why not in diversity? Now, it's fair to say that HE is not alone in this. Let's be clear, at the moment, we're working alongside universities, we're working with British Gas, Channel 4, HSBC, First Group, and so on. And it's a problem that needs tackling in all of them as well. But they're focused on their particular area of expertise and commerce and their particular markets. But don't we in higher education have the ability to range wider? Don't we in higher education pride ourselves on our ability to confront and tackle the greatest challenges that the world faces? So what, as Lenin would say, is to be done? Now, you may think that Lenin is not the most fashionable ally these days, but remember, I went to Sussex. So naturally, when I was at Sussex, I was a Maoist. I was only a Maoist not for very long, but I was. And my favourite Maoist slogan, which I'll just tell you about, the university's on the Falmer Road, those of you that know it, and in pursuit, no doubt, of higher grants or lower fees. The leaflet was published with the Maoist slogan on the top: store grain and blockade the Falmer Road. So that was great. Although, actually, the best slogan, I should remember this, the best slogan of the era belonged to academics. You may remember, you may have marched under this yourself, down Oxford Street, under the incendiary, revolutionary slogan, rectify the anomaly. Oh, that drove us to the barricades. I'm amazed they didn't put it in Les Mis. Actually, I stopped being a Maoist quite quickly. I didn't mind being called bourgeois, but I did object to being called a deviation. So, what is to be done? Firstly, what is absolutely clear from our work is that this is a question of deciding that you, the VC, wants to pursue diversity. It is, as you can see from what Chris has said, in the first place, fundamentally a question of leadership. There is, of course, a role for council, and Janet alluded to that, and we can talk about it in the Q&As, but I just want to focus for the moment on what I think you, as VCs and leaders, can do. If you don't believe that there's a real educational rationale for pursuing diversity, if you don't think diversity will improve the academic and overall performance of your institution, then don't pursue it. There's little point in just paying lip service to it, because the state of diversity across the sector has shifted so slowly and really so little that if you're going to take this on, your leadership needs to drive fundamental change. Achieving diversity needs fundamental shift in resources, in processes, and time invested. Secondly, what follows from that in our experience is not only do you need to make changes for the future, but you need to take a rigorous look at what you're doing at the moment. The diversity industry, if I can call it that, is riddled with initiatives. We worked with a utility recently, and I asked them to produce a list of what they were doing to recruit women. 6 pages of initiatives. The result? 15 women recruited in 1 year. Stephen Frost, who was the very successful Olympics diversity chief and whose book, The Inclusion Imperative, is well worth a look, is now head of diversity at KPMG. He says they have 17 initiatives to promote women in KPMG. For the last 8 years, the percentage of women in the partners at KPMG has remained at 14%. Black History Month, Gay History Month, they're all fabulous. They can serve a purpose and they can create a focus. But they do not change the fundamentals of the way in which you recruit and promote people or the culture within your organization. That needs investigation, systematic change, and measurement of results. So the new slogan for the Falmer Road is store grain, rectify the anomaly, and stop the initiatives. Thirdly, there needs to be a conversation about diversity throughout your whole organisation. In the work we've done, we've discovered that when staff and students together develop the rationale for diversity themselves, it produces a richness and a buy-in to what diversity means and its potential, which is powerfully specific to the narrative and soul of your university. In one major Russell Group university with which we're working at the moment, we engaged 175 professional and manual staff and students to develop the educational rationale for diversity. And they came up with this set of 7 bullets to guide the changes they want to make. Diversity creates a richer university experience because education is about contact with new ideas. Diversity in people creates the opportunity to encounter that diversity of thought. Diversity is driven by social justice and equality. The educational rationale is a mechanism to put those values into action and to relate them to the institution's core aims. Students come to us from schools which are geographically described, and so university opens up new horizons through contact with difference. This enables students to learn that different cognitive processes bring different ways of approaching and solving problems. Recognizing that difference supports the development of a critical intelligence, which is our core purpose. A more diverse student body creates the need for a more diverse curriculum. And a more diverse research population makes the institution more robust because it enables it to investigate more widely, have more of a worldview, and embrace challenge. The contract between students and the university is about breaking down barriers, experiencing challenges, and discovering the new. Diversity in the staff and the curriculum delivers that experience. We learn to be better people when we overcome prejudices and preconceptions, so diversity has a long-term impact to the benefit of society. Students are diverse, so we serve them better with a diversity of approach and a diversity of staff, so they go out into the world where work is global. Diversity prepares them for that and fosters the cultural agility for work and life. Those are all verbatim quotes from that process of that conversation, and they form an initial framework for the changes they want to make. And the striking thing I think about them is that how diversity is seen by those staff and students as driving the core purpose of the institution. And finally, the pressures of the ref. Those pressures drive institutions towards very traditional consequences of recruitment. There is a huge rush on to appoint the best person for the job, the person with the best existing track record. And inevitably this, in the majority of cases, simply reproduces the existing patterns of employment. The pressures of the ref have by and large not been good for diversity. I know of one life sciences department in which the head, getting the department ref ready, decided to give more time to the leading researchers so they could build on their research and load the teaching onto the others with those of a lesser research record. As a result, because he didn't think to ask the question, he separated the men from the women. Similarly with appointments to senior management, there just aren't any women. We can't find any black people. We hear it constantly. Well, what does that really tell us? It tells us that we have to work seriously on that pipeline. It tells us that we have to look harder and promote more adventurously and ensure that we support those people to succeed. And here's the point. We now have the biggest window until the next ref. This is the time to experiment. This is the time to recruit and promote for potential, to develop that pipeline, so that when the next day of judgment comes round, you do have the candidates. And by the way, tell that to the headhunters. Even if we research on our own, we have or we should have groups of docs and postdocs around us. The curriculum and teaching is developed by us in teams. Most research is interdisciplinary, and research challenges are complex. And so we know from all our experiences at work and in play that diversity produces high performance. Think of football. Now, I don't want you to leave today with any misapprehension whatsoever that I either know or care about football. I don't. Mention football to me, the gay gene comes out. Hate the game, love the legs. But teams have to be made up of diverse talents. Bletchley Park. We could talk about Bletchley Park. You would never have a successful team in football of all strikers and all goalies. Research and experience tells us that diverse teams tackle problems and perform better than homogeneous teams because they have a wider range of approaches, disciplines, and heuristics, and that the creative abrasion catalyzed by differences of identity and approach, when it is well managed, is what ignites the power of interdisciplinarity, what drives better decision-making and raises performance. We tackle very little on our own. We meet very few challenges with just the benefits and tools of our own discipline or our sole intelligence. We work in teams. So although it sounds counterintuitive, here's my point. Don't appoint the best person for the job. Stop doing that and appoint the best team for the job. So just in conclusion, make a choice about whether you think that Chris and I are right, that diversity will enhance the performance of your institution. If you don't think that, fine. If you do think that, give leadership and drive structural change in resources and processes. Audit initiatives. Get rid of the ones that don't work and foster the survival of the effective. Start a conversation throughout your university to develop your own institution's story about what diversity means and how it will enhance the educational value that your staff and students offer to the world. And create the pipeline. Grab the chance now to recruit and promote for potential and create teams of difference. Thanks very much for listening.